Hello everyone, welcome to, I suppose, video 2 of our finishing series. I say suppose because we also kind of did the making of this ring if you're following along. Anyway, so today we're going to be focusing on sanding entirely. This is all this video is going to be about. This is where you're going to do the most of your work, where you get definitely the most finicky with getting the right finish, because if you can set up the finish in sanding properly, then your polish is going to turn out really good. There are a few tricks that I'll show you along the way, and I'm also going to show you all the tools, well, not all the tools, but most of the tools that we use in our finishing process. That is not to say that this is the only tools that exist. There's plenty others, but this is what works for us. This is what we have on hand. So for some sanding processes, it's almost closer to the filing or grinding step. We're not going to be showing you that aspect because we kind of referred to that back in the filing video with the 2x72 belt grinder we have in the back room. That one is technically sanding, but with a 24 grit belt, it's kind of a mid-ground. Now we do have belts that go up to 3000 grit. It depends on what you're doing. If you're working on a great big bangle, maybe that would be a good way to go. But we're not going to touch on it in this video. We're just going to be working on hand tools and finishing a more typical jewelry type piece. So these are the tools that we use, generally speaking, for our sanding process, working from left to right. These are a basic sanding stick. As you can see, I got this paint stick from Home Depot. I label it with 220, and I just wrap half of a sheet of silicon carbide sandpaper around. I secure it with some of these copper wire things. I just drilled a couple of holes. You could use tape or whatever works, but this is one of the most simple and effective ways to start the sanding process. I use 3 specific grits. All silicon carbide. I'm always going to be using silicon carbide because it's also wet dry. It's very useful. And silicon carbide is generally very durable as well. It lasts. All sandpaper wears down, but it's very consistent in the way it wears down. So it's very useful. Anyway, so the grits I use are 220, 400, and 600. And in that order. And the reason for that is if you're not aware of how grit works, essentially grittiness is measured by how many particles are in a square inch. So on 220 grit, for every square inch, there should be 220 particles. So that's one of the ways. I also have these here. These are virtually the same type of deal, except these are an actual, like a product you can buy, and these are a belt, essentially a sanding stick belt on a plastic holder, I suppose, that are all labeled. I've kind of written on this. So this is my 600 one. You could, in theory, put 600 on any color. It doesn't matter. But anyway, when you're working with this, if a spot wears out, you can just rotate the belt and get a fresh piece. So you can use up the entire belt. You don't have to keep switching your little sandpapers like some of these other ones that I'll get to in a second. Anyway, and these have a number of features that I really like. Well, the shape is very good in the sense that you get this nice crisp edge. So if you need to sand in a very small crevice, this is very useful. You also have these long flats on both sides, so you can get a nice long stroke for sanding, just like when you're filing. And there's also this little bit of slack at the back if you need to get something rounded. And there's also the rounded side. I don't necessarily use back here too much, but it's still useful to have. Anyway, and they also come in different colors, and there's tons of refills as well. I believe I got this as like a starter kit, and this is a massive starter kit. Honestly, this will do me for quite a while, but it's very useful to have, and I'm pretty sure you could even use these belts on other products as well. If you have a small little belt sander, that'd be kind of neat. Anyway, we won't get into that. So these are kind of the hand options when it comes to sanding. Now, to get into more power tools using the Fordham Flex Shaft, we're going to be talking about my main one that I use. That's the split mandrel. Now, there are a variety of these kinds. Here's one variety here. This one's been tapered. And they also come in very widths and sizes and all sorts of things that suit your needs. This is just the simple option that Guesswin has. I would like to experiment with these and see if there's any other options out there. I can conceive of a few ideas, but I won't get into that right now. Anyway, so the split mandrel is one of my favorite ones that I use. And essentially you just wrap a strip of sandpaper around it like so. Just slot it in, start it up, and you kind of make a little roll that you can work with. And then when you're working on your ring, you just kind of work on the inside like so. You can also work on the outside. Very versatile, very useful to have. And this, of course, works with any grit, any size you want. You can cut this strip short or long, it doesn't matter. Whatever works for you. Another one that I really like are these discs. So these come pre-cut in one of these, well, I got this variety pack, but you can buy them in like little tubes. This is very useful because, you know, just like a roll, it's good for generally big surfaces, but say you've got a design that's very, very small or very, very detailed and you want to get into like a little crevice or something, this allows you can flip you can flip the disc any which way you want, and you can sneak into those little details and sand just to get a nice finish. There's also different kinds, as you can see here on the lid, it's all labeled. And we've got Emery paper. Now these are only labeled in a very generalized grit. So we've got coarse, medium, and fine. It's not exactly a science, but if I had to say, let's just test here. Let's grab one of each and we'll just feel it. We'll give a loose interpretation of what a coarse, medium, and fine disc is like. So the coarsest, you can probably see that on camera, is very large. These particulates are huge. I would say this is somewhere between a 60 and an 80 grit, maybe, just by looking at it and feeling it. This is the medium. I would say this is maybe somewhere between 100 and 120, maybe a little bit grittier. It's hard to say exactly. And then fine, this one feels maybe like a 220. Actually, we've got 220 right here. What does that feel like? I'm feeling the edge because the edge is pretty much new. Yeah, I would say that's very similar. So the finest one is about a 220. If you were to start with Emery paper, you would basically start with the fine disc. Now, anyway, so there's all different kinds. They're all different, labeled different ones. So there's the sanding one, Emery, Adalox. I don't know what Adalox is, but whatever. Magnum plastic, felt. So there's all different kinds. The paperback ones tend to be the least durable, and these plastic back ones are really, really awesome. I find that the grit actually wears off before the disc itself actually ever takes any heavy damage. And lastly, we'll talk a little bit about these guys. I don't have a whole lot of experience with them. These are pretty much the only ones I own. I think I have a couple others as well, but anyway, I just don't use them too much. These are silicon grit ones. Anyway, it's like a silicon material that's been impregnated with the grit itself. So as these wheels spin, they wear down. I believe the brand of these is Kratex. Kratex has been around forever, because I think these actually came from a kit I was given. I think it was from the 80s even. They're very old, but they work. They're tried and true. And they're all labeled different colors, so they have a different grit. The nicest thing about these is that you can reshape them. As you can see with this one, it's been turned into a kind of like a conical shape, so you can get a really nice fine cut almost. If this is the right grit, you could do a cut, not just a polish. Some of these are actually designed with diamond inside them instead, so those are really, really good for sharpening carbide or working with tungsten rings or whatever. They're very, very good. But like I said, I don't have too much experience, but I thought I should bring them up as they are just one of the many tools that you can use for the sanding process. All right, so let's continue on with this copper blank ring that we started in the last one. Right now, we have done all the rough filing work, and you can see there's like grit lines on the surface. That's from the file itself, and that's fine. What we're going to be doing is, with the sandpaper, taking those grit lines off. We're going to start with, as I mentioned before, with 220 grit. 220. I'm going to start with the hand one, just for the sake of showing you the technique. Spoiler alert, it's very similar to the filing. And then, because I'm a practical man, I'm going to be switching over to the flex shaft. If you don't have a flex shaft, then obviously you'll have to stick with the hand method. There's nothing wrong with it. It just takes a little bit longer. So anyway, let's get started. So just like filing, I'm going to be working like so. Unlike a file though, sandpaper can work both ways. So if you want to kind of get as much energy out of your stroke as you can. So for those of you who did not watch the filing video, we're going to be working in the direction of the object like this so that we can get a nice curve into the stroke. And that's essentially going to make sure that we have no flat spots, because flat spots will become immediately apparent after the polishing stage when you'll see, it won't look like a mirror. You'll see a mirror that has like weird distortions in it, basically. So anyway, working this way, we can make sure that the ring stays nice and round and we get a nice even finish all the way through. You may also want to work on your bench pin like this. Same with the filing. The bench pin just gives you a little bit of like an anchor, basically. It gives you a place that you can push and actually get some nice leverage on your piece, which holds it all nice and steady and helps keep everything level and square. So that's been like one round around. Now I'm going to do this a couple of times, but I'm going to switch over to the flex shaft as I mentioned, and I'll show you how to do that technique. If you are stuck with hand tools though, for doing that, you'll notice that this doesn't work for the inside of the ring. It's just simply too big. You don't have to use a paint stick. You can still use this method, but instead wrap it around a piece of round wood dowel that you can also get at the hardware store very cheaply. Just cut that to length. You could even get them in various thicknesses or diameters rather, and you can make a great inner ring polishing, sanding stick, basically. So switching over to the flex shaft, I'm going to be using a split mandrel. For those of you who are not familiar with flex shafts, it's very similar to like a Dremel tool. I've found that the Dremel name, a brand name, has almost become a verb. I'm gonna Dremel it type of thing. Well, Fordham has been around. I don't know if they've been around longer or whatever. Anyway, they're more of a jewelry grade tool because of a few reasons. For one thing, the handpiece itself doesn't contain the motor. It's just a useful attachment. The rest, the motor is actually at the end of this flex shaft at the top, hanging on a hanger. And that essentially just gives me this is nice and light, gives me the chance to be very dexterous. And say this particular handpiece didn't work for this job, I can always switch it out for another one. Anyway, for this, I have wrapped this piece of 220 sandpaper around, and we'll get to work. So just a note, very similar to the filing, but again, I'll reiterate if you didn't watch that, I'm always going to turn the tool on very regular intervals. You can see if I started to work on just one side and I just got it down to where I wanted it, then I went over, what I'm probably going to do is create, almost a border or like a ridge between the area that I overworked. Ideally, you want to work the ring consistently all the way around, turning very regularly. With using the hand tools, you can kind of count your strokes. With this, I'm just kind of counting every couple of seconds. And I'm also trying to keep the RPM of the tool the same so that it doesn't overwork as well. And of course, I'm trying to keep the tool parallel with the ring so that everything stays nice and flat. Now, obviously, if you're working on a rounded ring, like a rounded wedding band on the top, that's not necessarily going to be possible. You'll probably have to kind of maneuver your tool around and accommodate that roundness of the ring. So let's just do one more pass because I can see a couple of little spots. Let's Let me just bring the light over so you can see a little bit easier here. So you can see there's a little bit of a groove right here. That's left over from the filing. That might have been a little bit of a low spot where I just kind of got at the right angle and managed to nick it. There's one right there, a little bit there, etc. So we're going to just go back over and make sure all of that is gone, because this is where everything gets set up for the next steps. This is the roughest, so we're doing the most material removal. And then from there, we're just kind of taking off the grit lines. So we're not actually doing any shaping. This is where we have to get it right, because all those little nicks are going to show up in the 600 grit if we don't get it right now. It's very important to note that. You have to get everything right and true early on. So do your rough filing for the rough shape, then sanding at your roughest grit, get out all those lines, and just keep working that exact same philosophy through. Get rid of all the lines that you made in the previous until you get to your polishing stage. So something I want to reiterate while I'm working on this, that this dust is not good for you. Any dust. I mean, if you're working in a wood shop, metal shop, doesn't matter. It's inevitable. You're always going to be dealing with dust in the air. Try to minimize it as much as physically possible. In the jewelry industry, we have dust collectors, special ones, because we want to capture all of that precious metal dust. If over the course of a year, you can easily get a couple of grams of gold reclaimed from your sanding and polishing, and that's a few grams that are back into your pocket. You don't want to be tossing out money. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that finish now. I can see a couple of little dimples, but I don't know if that's worth getting out. It's going to be so slight. And again, this is a practice piece, so that's just something to note. If it happened and you know how it happened, well, just don't do it again in your next one. Anyway, moving on. So that is 220 on the outside face. Hopefully you can tell the difference between the filed finish and the sanded finish. It definitely doesn't have the same kind of grit lines as what the filing did. Those lines are just going to get smaller and smaller until eventually it's not really a gloss finish. It's more of a matte finish. The polishing stage, which is another video entirely, is going to be able to put that polish on. So now that I've done the outside with 220, we can't forget the inside of the ring. And thankfully, due to just the nature of this tool, spinning in a rotary fashion, it'll be very simple to sand all of that very easily. Just to go back a little bit, the sides, working on the sides, there's a very simple way of doing this. You can, on the tabletop, just put a flat piece of sandpaper and work, or on your little anvil or something, and anything that's flat, basically. And you can work your ring around and get those sides nice and clean, or you can go back to your hand tool and work like this. Again, you always want to be working or rather rotating your piece so that you don't create any flat spots. In the case of working on a side like this, if you just kept working one like that, what you'll probably end up getting is kind of a sway, because if you're right or left-handed, it doesn't matter. It just kind of varies the direction of the sway. But you tend to work one side more than you do the other, just based off of your whatever hand you're using. So just by rotating the piece, that counteracts any kind of sway that you might be adding, and keeps everything, again, nice and square and true. You won't need to do this very much, because you've set up, hopefully, with files, making this all exactly the way it should be. And this is just kind of refining that overall finish, just like we're doing on the rest of the piece. Something to note, just as I'm working on this, the sandpaper will wear down, and you'll actually notice a fair difference between this to about here, because that is what was actually touching the ring. So between here to here, that's what was actually doing the sanding work on the ring. That spot is now going to be a little bit worn down, so we can tear that off, put that in the catch, and now we have a fresh piece of sandpaper. You can see how much dust is coming up. Not good. Something I'm feeling right now is that there's a lot of friction going on the inside, and I'm holding this very tightly. So there's a lot of heat. It doesn't help that it's also copper. Copper is one of the best heat conductors, and I'm feeling every little bit in my fingertips. If you were smart, unlike me, I'm not going to go get anything, but if you had a piece of leather or something you could wrap around this to hold your ring, it would definitely help with that heat problem, and also maybe give you a little bit of a better grip. So I'm happy with this finish now at a 220. The next steps are going to be exactly the same thing, so we'll kind of speed through those, but through 400 and 600. So we'll show you a little bit of each through, just so you can see the difference of the grit lines. But for the most part, it's exactly the same process. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the 3D printed ring in silver. And this one is going to be very much the same sanding process, but obviously I've got a lot more detail on this model, so I need to be a bit more careful. And in some cases, this just isn't going to cut it. For example, getting inside of this design, there's like a border on both sides, which prevent me from getting down. I don't want to sand away the border, so I'm going to be very gentle when I work on this. I'm not going to apply much downward pressure onto the ring. For the most part, it's just going to be sides and inside work. And for the inside, I would probably cut sandpaper into a very narrow strip. If you've got any of these belt sanding things like I mentioned before, maybe you can go that route. It really depends. For the most part, the entire point of doing the 3D printing and casting is that you get a finished piece a lot easier. I don't want to say easier. I want to say the majority of the work should have been done in your printing. In other words, if the printing finish isn't good, then the cast isn't going to be good, which means you're going to be doing way more work in the end. Is that work equivalent to simply doing a good print? Even if that means switching your resin, it's up to you to make that decision. The goal, obviously, of every resin and cast is to be as flawless as possible. So when it comes out, you snip it, file off the sprue, and ideally just go straight to polish. I've never had that happen, mind you, but maybe in the near future, we'll see. So now we're going to move on to 400 grit, and depending on how good your casting may have come out, you could actually start at 400. There's no rule that says you have to start at 220, or maybe you want to start at 120 and work all the way up. It doesn't really matter. I'd like to choose my starting grit depending on the file finish. If, for example, this was how my casting came out, then I might actually just start at 400, spend a little bit more time on that, 6, polishing, and then you're done. So it depends. You kind of have to make that judgment call, and that judgment call is going to become better the more you're doing this. So there's a 400 grit. It's getting more to be what I would call a matte finish. If that's if that's a goal of yours, then maybe you want to stop at 400, but we're going to continue all the way through. And that is a 600 grit finish. Not a whole lot different from 400, but you will see a little bit more of a shine. You can kind of see that very, I'm not even sure if the camera is going to pick that up, but there's the silver solder seam right there. just a very faint line. So that's all now perfectly flush. Couldn't even feel that if we wanted to. Same on the inside. And this is basically ready for polish. They do make sandpaper above 600, but use that as needed. If there's a reason why you can't do buffing, then yes, definitely consider that. But for the most part, a buffing wheel is very versatile, if not more versatile than sandpaper, because you can get into a lot more different areas depending on the buffing wheel style, shape, material, etc. And the polishing compounds can be very gritty as well. It really depends on your application. But anyway, they make sandpaper all the way up to, you know, the 5-digit range. We're talking like 10,000 plus. And then I think you get into more pastes and stuff, and that's a different beast entirely. So this is what they look like now, and these are ready for polishing. So that is our basic sanding process. As I mentioned earlier on in the video, there are many other tools and methods that you can use. We've only covered what we do on a basic jewelry level to prepare our castings and fabricated pieces for the polish. A lot of the hand sanding techniques are very similar to the filing ones. If you watch that video, if you haven't, take a look. We're going to be moving on with this process very shortly into the polishing stage, so stay tuned for that video as well. If you like this content, please like and subscribe. We also have a membership program and many other videos coming down the road. We've got lots of tools on order that I'm going to be reviewing and showing you how to use. Also interesting kind of out-of-the-box ways, DIY options, etc. So thank you very much for watching. I will see you guys in the next video.